This morning I want to discuss with you one and perhaps I would say probably two different isms because they really go together. We're right at almost the very end of our discussion of American worldviews and philosophies. The first of these is relativism, and then the next one is what it's going to lead to. It has already led to it. We saw a tremendous upheaval of rage and bitterness and anti-everything that was traditional and right and good here in this country just 20 years ago, back in the decade of the 1960s, especially the late 1960s. And I think that eventually we'll either see that again or we'll see another result of that, which I will also talk about here in a moment. But relativism, that is certainly a plague in American society today. I'm sure if you have been reading over the last year anything at all, you've heard of Alan Bloom, who is just an unsaved professor in Illinois. But Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. The Closing of the American Mind. Now, he is a professor who has translated works of Plato, who's a Platonic scholar. He's translated works of Rousseau, the French writer. He's written some after Shakespeare's writings. He's a very well-qualified, intelligent man. And he's a philosopher himself. And for him to write a book entitled The Closing of the American Mind that addresses the situation of public formal education in America is just astounding that you would have that type of title. What we are told, as we discussed with intellectualism, is that's just the end thing. Intellectualism is get all the education that you can. And he entitles his book The Closing of the American Mind. And he tells us what closes the mind. What puts a person in such a bind and such constriction and forces principles upon them that are not true at all is education. We're taught just the opposite, that when you get education, your mind is broadened and expanded and you're allowed to think independently. Well, that's only true in the sense that you are deceived away from some of your traditional values. But what you are taught is a system of principles and values, or the lack of them, that are forced upon you. And one of these values happens to be the principle of relativism. The subtitle of his book, The Closing of the American Mind, is this: How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students. Now, when Bloom first published this book, no one dreamed that it would make the bestsellers book list, New York Times bestseller book list for 3 or 4 months at the #1 spot running, that it sold almost 500,000 copies. Bloom said rather wryly himself, I thought it might sell 3,000 or 4,000 copies, 75% of whom I would know who bought them. In other words, colleagues of his. Why such a book? Why such an attraction? To even use the term in your subtitle, soul, that's not a term that the intellectuals use. How higher education has impoverished the souls of our students today. But the reason I'm mentioning Alan Bloom's book is the first chapter, his introduction, which is entitled Our Virtue, the first sentence, and this has just been quoted around the world ever since Bloom published this book last year. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. This is from a non-Christian writer here. Very first sentence has been quoted by Christians and non-Christians alike because people can't believe that Bloom had the insight to say some of these things. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the students' reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the position as not self-evident astonishes them. You know, if they find someone who's an absolutist, who believes in absolutes, it just astonishes the student. And he ought to know he has years, like 3 decades of teaching experience, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. These things you don't think about. The students' backgrounds are as various as America can provide. Some are religious, some atheists, some are to the left, some to the right. Some intend to be scientists, some humanists or professionals or businessmen. Some are poor, some rich. They are unified only in their relativism and in their allegiance to equality. And the two are related in a moral intention. The relativity of truth is not a theoretical insight, but a moral postulate, the condition of a free society, or so they see it. They have all been equipped with this framework early on, and it is a modern replacement of the inalienable natural rights that used to be the traditional American grounds for a free society. That it is a moral issue for students is revealed by the character of their response when challenged. A combination of disbelief and indignation. Are you an absolutist? They would ask. The only alternative they know, uttered in the same tone as, are you a monarchist, or do you really believe in witches? This latter leads into the indignation, for someone who believes in witches might well be a witch hunter or a Salem judge. The danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance. Well, that may kind of go over your head for some of Bloom's fancy writings, but the first statement is what I just wanted to read to you this morning. He said one thing that almost every professor can be sure of, that almost every student entering believes in relativism. So what is relativism? Well, I hardly have to define it for you. Relativism is the principle, the ism, the philosophy, that there aren't any absolutes. There aren't absolutes in marriage, in church, in government, in morals, in ethics, in theology, in religion, in metaphysics. There aren't any absolutes. All things are relative to a person, who they are, their background, their culture, their upbringing, their intelligence, their financial ability, their social upbringing. Everything is relative. What this amounts to then is a huge attack upon the Christian faith, because the Christian faith makes explicit the claim that things are not relative. They may not be judged and juggled according to someone's background or culture, how they were brought up, or how intelligent they are or are not, or what type of money they have or home they own. That truth is not relative to those things. That truth is absolute. That ethics are not relative. That ethics are absolute. Morals are not relative. Scripture is not relative. The Bible is not relative. God is not relative, as though he could be one way for one person but change and be another way for another person. Amen. What we have is this huge attack on biblical Christianity and a reversal of the creation order, where God said, let us make man in our image. Now man says, let us make God in our image. A whole reversal of that, where man wants to be able to treat God the way he wants. He wants to hold God and his word on a leash. Now, to begin with, you see all these things are related. It's related to humanism. It's related to intellectualism. And we see ironies in the midst of all of this. Take what we just discussed most recently, as I was giving you some information on here not that long ago, the ironic result of humanism. I mean, what humanism is supposed to be after. And you see, humanism, it's all part of the same thing. Relativism, the truths of God are relative. It was all right to believe in immediate creation back when we didn't know any better. But now that we have modern proof and geology and the rocks, and we have astronomy, well, we can tell certain things have been here for trillions and billions and countless trillions of years. So certain things are relative. They wouldn't judge earlier man. They would just say earlier man was in a different state. It was okay to believe in healing and demons and things then. Now we have proof that those things don't happen, that miracles don't happen, that there aren't any, extra temporal physical beings called demons. So we believe differently today. So humanism, its whole goal is the glorification of man, to exalt man. It's man's proud attempt to glorify himself in his own reason and his own existence, to make his existence absolute and final and ultimate. But the irony of it all is then why do you make your ancestors chimpanzees? If you had, and they really do, if you had two options and you're claiming to be intelligent, I mean, intellectualism goes along with humanism. The humanists are trained generally in higher education. A good mind, intellect, would tell you, make yourself a descendant of the gods. Don't make yourself the descendant of a rodent.
Amen.
I mean, just intelligence would tell you that. If you're going to dream up a theory, dream up the theory that you descended from Zeus or from maybe the biblical God or something. It would lend more dignity to your personality. But rather, they expect us to believe their old lie and their nonsense about evolution. That we have evolved from these things, that we have evolved from some germ in a swamp. Well, that's ignorance gone to seed. Intelligence would pretend that you had descended from a god. And you don't even have to pretend. The Bible gives you that account, that we, mankind, did not come from slime in a swamp, but he came from the finger of God.
Amen.
That he was created by God. And they expect us to believe them in all this nonsense. But look who's telling us to believe them. An evolutionary freak, an accidental collection of molecules. Look who's telling us to believe them, an accidental collection of molecules. I mean, it's absurd that people who claim that then claim to have intelligence. I mean, who's to say your intelligence is real? I mean, who's to say anything is going on whenever a person is as ignorant and as dumb as that? The whole theory is self-destructive and counterproductive. Whenever you're trying to glorify man and you glorify him by giving him the worst origin possible, rather than the biblical origin, or rather than maybe a Greek origin of the eternal pre-existence of the soul, you have him evolving out of a slimy swamp somewhere. So that all the person ends up, who's telling us that, he ends up to be nothing but a glorified germ then. A glorified humanistic germ with a PhD in germtology, I guess.
Yeah.
They know a lot about it. They know a lot about their background, and they come to find out whenever they die that wasn't even their background to begin with. But as we do some of these things, let me just turn relativism around and show you that the very statement and claim itself is self-contradictory. I think we've done this with all of these claims. What relativism, if we want to put it in a nutshell, claims is this little phrase right here. You can get it down in 3 words. Everything is relative. That's what relativism is. Everything is relative. They don't want to bind you with truth. All you got to do is get on a college campus and try to witness or minister to someone. And everything is relative. They'll say that's what Bloom says. Every student that enters the university today, the professor can be assured of one thing. He might come from who knows what type of background, but he'll be duped 100% into the theory of relativism. Everything is relative. What that is saying is there aren't any fixed, eternal truths or norms. There are no such thing as fixed things that are always right, that are norms, that are standards. There's no such thing as that. Everything is relative. You can't depend on something, in other words, to be always true. Sometimes it might be true, sometimes it might not be true. You have to understand this. This is what they mean by relativism, that you cannot depend on anything to always be true. Everything is relative. All right, let's take the philosophy of relativism then. It claims everything is relative. What that means is relativism is only relative. If you just said everything is relative, that there's no fixed thing that you can depend on, well then we can't have a fixed thing called relativism that tells us that everything is relative.
Yeah.
You see, the theory itself is self-contradictory. It claims that everything is relative, that you can't depend on a fixed norm. But what they're trying to tell us through it all is that relativism is that fixed norm. That it is something that you can believe that everything is relative. If everything is relative, then so is the statement that everything is relative. That would mean that at least on some occasions, if everything is relative, at least on some occasions, that thing must be relative and sometimes it must not be. If even it's relative, if even it changes, it's not fixed, it fluctuates, then even the philosophy and the statement itself of relativism is relative. It's relative to certain times and places. That means sometimes it may not work. What is in the place of relativism if it's gone? What's the opposite of relativism? Absolutism.
Amen.
If everything is relative, so is relativism. If relativism is sometimes relative, that means sometimes it isn't. And what's the opposite of that? Absolutism. You see what they're saying? They don't even know it. These ignoramuses. You can't help but remind yourself of Romans 1 all the time. Professing themselves to be wise, they became utter fools. They can't see that in their very claim everything is relative. You've just taken the ground out from underneath yourself by denying the fact that relativism is a fixed principle that does not change or alter. And if it ever changes or alters, you only have one thing you can go to after that, and that's absolutism. And as Bloom says, if you say that you believe in absolutism, they'll say, what's wrong? You believe in witches too? It's like you're a person from another day, another planet. You're from another generation, 16th century or 15th century or something. You believe in absolutism? You believe in witches? You believe that the earth is the center of the universe? They put you back there with all those ignoramuses. And what they don't see is that they are the ignoramuses themselves. Now, what relativism and what all of these other things are going to lead to, which is the second ism I want to discuss this morning and spend most of my time on that, is the philosophy that Nietzsche made so popular that is just, I have a feeling in the pit of my stomach over what this world is coming to with these false beliefs that it now has, and that is nihilism. 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 Nihilism means nothingness. Nietzsche, the German philosopher of the 19th century, was an atheist who taught that doctrine in philosophy, nihilism. That's what the world is coming to, nihilism. That there is emptiness, there's rage and confusion and emptiness that we're going to see in the world. People simply don't understand how important, I don't even think the church of our day understands how important it is to maintain biblical truth. Whenever that's surrendered, then you've got some false option that the devil will present, that Satan will present. Now, he doesn't generally present to people nihilism. Who wants to believe in nothingness? But that, friends, is the end product of all these other isms we've talked about. You don't have anything at the end of the day then. And what it reminds me of, and what I want to spend a little time on, is what characterized the late half of the decade of the 1960s. Now, I realize some of you weren't even born then, so you may not be able to totally appreciate it, but most of us were born and alive then, and I think maybe a large number of us in the church were in adolescent years or teenage years at that time. And the 1960s, see, we have come a long way in this country. We're not like that anymore. We've become much more sophisticated in our rebellion and in our unbelief. You still find remains of that in people, but I mean, this was a wholesale thing throughout our entire land and society. The flag burning and the rage and the four-letter words and all the profanity and blasphemy. And it was a sign of the fact that man didn't have a beachhead. He didn't have a focal point anymore. People didn't know where they were going because they weren't going anywhere. There wasn't meaning to life anymore. And so you have your experimentation with sex and with drugs and with all anti-social, anti-biblical type procedures and methods of behavior. People striving to find meaning to life. And they couldn't find meaning. And I think what characterized the 1960s was this spirit, this influence of nihilism, that nothing means anything. We found our government had been lying to us about the Vietnam War. If you can't trust your government, you can't trust your president, you can't trust your leaders, and you just can't trust anybody anymore then. And no one trusted anyone. And what was being taught in the colleges were new theories and new ideas and new ideals that weren't like the old ways, that weren't like what people even outside of the church were brought up with their white picket fence and good manners in their home when they were young in the 1950s. And now they're seeing something entirely different in the 1960s. And the devil had just had released a flood of filth and confusion, especially, I would say, on this country. Let me pick one year, maybe the worst of them all. Now, it started back in the early 1960s, whenever, well, just all types of things were happening. Elvis Presley was big in the late 50s and the early 60s, and no one had danced suggestively like that old hound dog did. And, I mean, he was changing right on the cutting edge of the beginning of rock and roll. And Elvis Presley was changing music forever. I mean, look what we had as a result of that. We went years with the same types of music. We had the most filthy, perverted, ear-splitting, just nothing but noise and racket around today. So all because of people like Elvis Presley, right on the cutting edge, swaying his hips, and females were just falling head over heels after him. And then a couple of years later, we've got the Beatles, who travel from England and show up on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was just a national experience whenever the Beatles first showed up on Ed Sullivan and sang their little songs. And here are these men, boys with English accents and mop hairdos, and I mean, no one else was dressed like that. No one else wore their hair that way. And they were on the cutting edge also of setting new trends and new ideals. And then you still find people down to this day, although some people have grown up, matured, and their hair has gone back up as their age has gone up and their wisdom and intelligence, you still find people, men I'm talking about, with old shaggy hair down their back and just old, gross, perverted type appearance before people. The Beatles set the scene for that. Elvis Presley set the scene for that. You remember that was the good old days of, Leave It to Beaver crew cuts and things. And you were in if you had a crew cut back in those days. Or if you didn't have a crew cut, you were just about skinned. I mean, you had a little tuft of hair. That's the way I used to be. I had a little tuft of hair up on the top of my head, and just down the side, you just didn't have any hair. And then, well, you know what you just called my wife then. I'm a bait for queer, you know what she is then. Well, that was before she met me, of course. But anyway, if she would have met me then, well, that would have been the one to fall in love with, someone who looks like everyone else. But then all of a sudden, the hair starts growing. Or the ears start going up. I never figured out which way it was. The ears were raised or the hair came down. Just down and down and down. And we're talking about people that lived in little small homes with white picket fences around them, that got the daily newspaper and their dad went off to work and they went to school and had fun and had cookies in their lunch and had little neat Roy Roger lunchboxes with them. And now you go to Led Zeppelin and Sting and all these weird things. I mean, down to little small children. You might have Lassie on your lunchbox back in those days. You'd be laughed at. You would be laughed at if you had Lassie on your lunchbox today. You've got to have Led Zeppelin or someone like that on your lunchbox. That means that you're in, that you're cool. All of this came about as a result of the 1960s. And a lot of us remember what was taking place then. Let me just give you a little synopsis of the events of one year. A year that I think, well, Time Magazine did an article on it, and they called it a knife that forever separated the past from the future. And I think that they're right. 1968 was just a climactic year for the existence of this country. That was a knife that pierced the soul of American society, that forever separated the past from the future. The two will never meet again. It will never be the same again. And dear friends, that's why we're having all these struggles in our own church and our own Christian life that I just don't think we would have in the earlier times. Amen. You've got the most wicked influences out there in the world that you can imagine right now, that you wouldn't have had in earlier days. I mean, from the music to the dress, just to, advertising, anything and everything out there. I think about that so often, that we are born in the worst times you could imagine, or we are growing up as Christians in the most wicked times. The 1950s, maybe the early 60s, just as that was beginning, it would be like, who are these weird people? The Beatles? The Monkees? Who are these weird people? And now if you're not like that, you're weird. You see, the devil wins the majority over his side, so he can put pressure on all the others to conform. And Paul says, don't be conformed to this world.
Amen.
But he puts pressure to conform. Now, if you're not like that, if you don't know the end songs or the end musical groups, you're just not in then. Oh, it would be horrible to be in school. School is a den of deception where the devil just reigns supreme. And it's totally wrong. It's totally wrong for children, for Christian children, to go to the public school system. They don't even have a choice. That is totally wrong. That's a sin against God. I mean, that's exactly the way I see it, and I've seen it for some time now. You don't have an option. There's not an option there. You see, it's because we've been deceived. We just thought that was the way that it's to be. It's the same as, going to a pornographic movie. Now, some Christians will say, well, I know that's a sin. That's because you were brought up with that being a sin. With public education, you were brought up with that being okay. That's not okay. It doesn't matter how you were brought up with it. And I realize it's worse today than it's ever been before. Yeah. But there has always been some humanism and some anti-biblical truth in public education. It doesn't matter how far it goes back. But no one has an excuse today. You might have some excuses in the 30s or 40s to go to public school and be a Christian. Not today, though. You get nothing but the filth of the world. But to tell you what I want to tell you, some of the events of 1968. Now, what this will be, now it won't register on some of you, but it will on most of us. Well, about half the people in the church are our children, so it won't register on any of them. But the other half, the adults, it will register on. And what this is, it's kind of like a group of pictures together where you're supposed to ask yourself the question, as anybody who lived through those years will ask themselves or remember. And I don't know how many of you are into all this, or some of you I know didn't go to college or whatever, and you didn't have some of these experiences, but you're to think, where was I when that happened? Like when they landed on the moon or circled the moon. I can remember exactly where I was when that happened. All these events of the late 1960s, you remember exactly where you were when you heard the news that President Kennedy or that Senator Kennedy was shot, or that Martin Luther King was shot, Jr. was shot, or whatever. You remember where you were. The radio, you turned the radio on, or you picked up a newspaper, or someone called you and you found out. It's like those people, myself not included, who woke up one morning late in the year 1941. And everyone remembers it was a Sunday morning, what they were doing, what was going on in their life when they heard the news. Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor has been attacked. My parents remember that. They know exactly where they were. It's because these are such tremendous events that shape the whole destiny of a nation, not just a person, but a nation, that you automatically seem to remember where I was when I heard the news. Like I remember exactly where I was whenever President Reagan was first shot back in 1980. I remember exactly where I was. We were out to dinner with someone in this church. I remember exactly where we were. We heard the news. The waitress came and told us, do you know the president's been shot? The president's been shot. And you hear something like that. Well, a woman had been caught with a gun around Nixon back in his years, but he wasn't shot though. We've gone, 15 years, really almost 20 years between JFK and President Reagan before a president was shot. That's a major event. I mean, shot. You see, whenever Kennedy was first shot, people didn't know, is he alive, dead, did it kill him or not? You don't know. We were the same way. Reagan has been shot. That's all that you hear. Or you hear all conflicting reports. He's dead, or he's okay, or Jim Brady's dead, or he's alive, or Delaney is dead, or he's okay, or you don't ever know what's going on. And I remember exactly where I was. Here are some things that happened. I'll go from January through December. You can write it down if you want to, or just sit and think about the utter rage that was boiling in this nation, and the confusion and chaos. And I would say it's nihilism. It's Nietzsche's nihilism. And we deserve it. And it is a result of surrendering the biblical God and the biblical revelation. That's exactly what it is. It's a result of surrendering that. And we're seeing in the evangelical world just lightly saying, well, I don't believe it makes any difference. You can't bind me that women can't teach, or Paul did. And lightly treating those things. Instead of with fear and trembling, crawling on your knees before the Bible and say, God, please don't let me be deceived. Please teach me the truth. They don't even care. They had the presumption to get their skills and their exegetical abilities and their higher education and their theological training, and then they go and dissect the Word. Now, I'm not talking about the liberals. The conservatives today dissect the Word, and this is for today, and that's not for today, and it's because of this and not because of that, and such a haughty, presumptuous attitude toward God. It's the spirit of the age that we live in. January 1968. January the 22nd. Now I mentioned this a few weeks ago because I've been studying some about this. You may not think it's big. You may laugh when I tell you what happened on that night. But it was almost like a sign of the times that, well, things are so bad. This world, this country is so wicked. There's no hope for us. I think the best thing to do is make a big joke about it and laugh about it. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In TV series began. Do you remember Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In? Goldie Hawn dancing in body paint. Tiny Tim tiptoeing through the tulips. Do you remember all of that? It's like there's so much rage and confusion. The best thing to do is just make a big joke about it. And that's what they did. They made a big joke about life. And the whole show was the most corny. I mean, it was worse than hee-haw. It was the most unbelievably corny, absurd show. That was the whole point of it. That's what life is coming to. It's an absurd merry-go-round. Life is nothing but an absurd merry-go-round. The only way that you're going to exist in it is just laugh it all off. Rather than inculcating in us, teaching us to be serious about life. Life's not a game. It's so deadly, as I've said before, everyone who ever participates in it dies.
Amen.
It's not just a merry-go-round. It's a one-way ticket to death. The only reason you're born is so that you can die one day.
Right.
It's not something to laugh about and play around with. And the whole show that lasted for several years, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, everybody was just laughing about everything. It was the corniest, most ridiculous show. But it was like a sign of the times. The next day, January the 23rd. Now, some of you are born after this, so I guess I'll be testing your American history then. Some of us remember these things and where we were and turning in that. We heard Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, this new television show. Next day, January the 23rd, the USS Pueblo was captured by North Korea. Some of you remember that? Oh, was that an event? I mean, that really struck at the gut of this nation. We're right in the middle of the Vietnam War. Or not quite in the middle. I'd say just a little bit this side of the middle, or the other side of the middle. We're leading up to the right smack dab in the middle of the Vietnam War. And the USS Pueblo is captured by North Korea. The officers are tortured, and they're not released. And the whole nation was in suspense over the capture by the North Koreans of the USS Pueblo. 7 days later, can you believe all of this happened? In 1968. I mean, what worth happening has happened in 1988 that's going to just go down in history? You know, now it's the most ridiculous things like Gary Hart got caught womanizing, or the most ridiculous things are being blown out of all proportion now. And you'll have story after story for month after month on the same old stupid things. It's not something important. It's not important at all. These are some important events that are taking place. January the 30th, which is New Year's. Which is New Year, not January the 1st, which is New Year in Southeast Asia. You remember what happened? The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese launched what they came to call the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive. Tet was their word for New Year. That's the Vietnamese New Year, January the 30th. It was a time when the American military forces there under General Westmoreland gave no thought at all, not on a holiday, not on a Vietnamese Southeast Asian holiday. There's no way. That's the best time to attack. Remember when the Jews were attacked in the intertestamental period? On the Sabbath day, the day when they couldn't defend themselves. No one ever dreamed that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, those were two different groups of people, as you remember. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese would attack on New Year's, on Tet for them. It's the anniversary of the Great Dragon for the Vietnamese. But they launched what we call now in history the Tet Offensive. That was the turning point in the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, to be sure, if you know your history, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese suffered tremendous casualties, way out of proportion to what we suffered. But what they did in it, I mean, they lost hundreds and thousands of men. They suffered tremendously, more than we suffered as far as, well, what was called the man count or the dead count, how many died. More Vietnamese, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong died than United States soldiers. We only lost 51,000 men in that whole war. I say only. Well, if it was your father or uncle, then I shouldn't use the word only, but 51,000? When 50 million people died in the Second World War, then 51,000 is like a drop in the bucket. But what they did is they broke the spirit and the backbone of the American forces. We never dreamed they would do it. They suffered tremendous casualties. They attacked like 33 out of 42 provincial capitals in South Vietnam, or what has become South Vietnam, and now it's just reincorporated. And by the way, you see, we did nothing at all. Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, we don't have anything anymore. South Vietnam has been incorporated right back into North Vietnam. The communists are in control of it. We wasted 51,000 American young men's lives over there. We wasted them. And forever since then, people in this country are disillusioned with war. No one wants to fight anymore because they know what our leaders are going to do. They're so humanitarian. You know, we don't want to drop the wrong type of bombs on, hey, listen, in war, everything is fair. You drop bombs on cities, you kill civilians, you kill children, you kill women, you do what you have to do to bring an end to the war. You don't say, well, now, wait a minute. Before I can fire, I have to tell that opponent of mine, I'm going to fire, I'm going to count to 3. That was our attitude in Vietnam. We didn't want to just do indiscriminate bombing on the levees that held back the Red River. Why? We were afraid the Red River in Vietnam would flood the whole nation, and it would wipe out a whole crop of rice. And if you wipe out the food, you're going to wipe out the people. Women and children would be starving. So instead of doing that, they sacrificed 51,000 of our men over there. They let the Vietnamese live, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. It doesn't make any sense. It's insanity to go to war with fair play. There's no such thing as fair play in war. Now, I'm against war. I think war is a horrible thing, but I know enough about people's existence that there's no such thing as fair play in war. Not in war. Now, maybe in football or baseball there's fair play, but not in war. Football and baseball, those are just games. War is not a game. It's a thing where it's either you or me. And you're a fool to say, well, I guess it'll be me. No, it always has to be the other person, the you. But our military strategy was so messed up and perverted. It was set up, in essence, so that we had to give them a 1, 2, 3 count before we could do anything. We had to get everyone's permission to do everything before anything could be done. And the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they didn't play by the rules. Hey, we're not supposed to be setting all those atrocious, bloody booby traps that they did. Well, they just set those things everywhere. And the poor United States servicemen who went over there feared for their lives, and that's why some of them are insane to this day. You never knew when you were going to put your foot down on one of those contraptions the Viet Cong set up, and you'd lose a leg. You didn't even want to leave camp. You'd hit one of those wires that would spring those darts and throw those darts into your heart. I mean, they played cruel over there. We had the firepower. We had the firepower if we would have bombed the capital city, if we would have bombed the important places of population. And so what did the Viet Cong do? They congregated there because they knew, well, those are Western people. Those are Christian people. Those are humanitarian people. They wouldn't bomb a place where there are innocent civilians. There's no such thing, friends, as innocent civilians. If your country got you into that war, it's too bad. It's too bad, but you're a part of it. You might be a baby. If you're a part of North Vietnam and your leaders got you into the war, you're into the war. There's no such thing as fair play like that. Make sure you hit the soldiers, but don't hit any of the women. And they learned that. They learned that we were Christian, that we were part of the West, that we were humanitarian. And so they strapped grenades to the back of children and sent them into a group of United States soldiers. The child would be blown to bits, and so were the soldiers. They didn't play fair. They played like you're supposed to play in war. You know what? They won. A little speck a little ridiculous group of pygmies over there beat the mightiest nation on the face of the earth. That's because of up here, friends, we had all these warped ideas, all this false knowledge and false ideas about things. We didn't go over there and fight a war to win a war. We went to play around. And a group of pygmies defeated the greatest giants on the earth today. Amen. And because we've tried to be fair and this, that, and the other, the Soviet Union has just overtaken us in military power. Well, now, blah, 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 we go on with our reasons why. After the Second World War, rather than us just camping out, we're just going to take over France and Spain and the Netherlands. We didn't do that. No, that's not the fair thing to do. It's not the humanitarian thing to do. So we went back home, and the communists just took over all of Eastern Europe. They didn't go home. Now, I thought that we were supposed to have the British and the Canadians and the Americans and the Soviet Union, and we're all supposed to play in this fair. We all won the war. We all fought together on the same side. It sounds strange today to think the United States and the Soviet Union fighting on the same side. But we were against the Germans. We attacked from the Western Front, and they attacked from the Eastern Front, and they attacked and never left. And stayed and took over Poland. And took over East Germany. But with our humanitarian concerns and so forth, we gave it back. Well, it all really began here, January the 30th, when the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive. It broke the spirit to fight of the United States servicemen over there, the Marines and the Army and the Air Force. It broke their spirit to fight. It broke their willingness. It broke their back that we had had such a tremendous offensive set upon us. They lost a lot of men, the Viet Cong, in doing it, but they won. You know, that's the irony of it all. They lost more men, but they won the battle. And they won the war, as a matter of fact. The next month, February the 12th, a book entitled Soul on Ice was published. Who was that by? Remember Eldridge Cleaver, that Black Panther leader? And oh, were the Black Panthers a force to contend with in the 1960s. They're not much around. They're just a political group around today. They were a radical, revolutionary, militaristic political group back in those days. And Eldridge Cleaver published his book, Soul on Ice. Now, of course, he was under a federal warrant for his arrest, the FBI, and he fled the country and lived over in Morocco, Africa, for many years. And he's just come home the last couple of years. And he's a so-called born-again Christian. And he has a new book out. This has been, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. It's been a long time ago. Soul on Fire. Soul on Fire. But I doubt his conversion experience. I don't know. I don't know enough about it, so I'll just say I doubt it. Because what I do know, it's a real compromising type existence. Well, anyway, what we have here with Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panthers, of course, is civil rights movement and demonstration. Now, we had some things earlier in this decade. James Meredith, remember the James Meredith case? President Kennedy, JFK, had to call out federal forces to get James Meredith in Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, the first black student ever allowed. Now, I thought that the slaves had been freed way back in the 1860s by Abraham Lincoln. They weren't freed. They weren't freed. We're 100 years later. They're no better than they were back in 1860. You can't even go and get an education. He can afford it, and he can't even go. They won't allow him in. The so-called separate but equal laws of the Supreme Court, which were stricken down. Separate but equal, that's a euphemism for keep the blacks in their place. Separate but equal, if they're separate, they're not equal. You can be sure of that. That was a liberal euphemism by the Supreme Court to keep the blacks in their place. Now, of course, the Supreme Court had to overthrow all of those decisions. Why can't those 9 silly men or 8 and 1 woman now make up their mind about things? Now, are the blacks or are they not? Well, you see, the Supreme Court kind of flows with the times. Back in those days in the 1950s, you weren't on the side of the blacks. You might be lynched yourself or have a cross burned in your front yard if you were down in the South anyway. You weren't on the side of the blacks. So we have these separate but equal, separate drinking fountains, separate schools. That's a euphemism for keep the niggers in their place. And I just say it that way because that's what the white people meant. Keep the niggers in their place. Separate but equal. That sounds good. Equal, equality, that's in the Constitution. Separate, that's not in the Constitution, though. No way. And if they are separate, you can be sure the blacks, whatever they have, the homes, the jobs, the schools, they'll be the leftovers of society. The whites aren't going to give them anything good. They're going to put them in the worst end of town to live. They're going to have all their logic for doing that. But anyway, James Meredith, federal forces, 1963 and 63 called out by, or 62 and 63 called out by President Kennedy. The governor of Mississippi refused. He's a governor. He's under the president's jurisdiction. He refused to obey the president's order. Right. As a matter of fact, he got, and you have to be from Mississippi to know what those Mississippi sheriffs can be like. It's an old boys club. They beat up on the Negroes down there and raped their wives. And you're not going to, and you got Kennedy. I mean, here is a Boston, Massachusetts Catholic, Irish Catholic type white boy, you know. And down south, the people that were from my era, we thought the white boys up there, they don't know what's going on. They don't know where it is, man. We even knew the language to use. They don't know what it was all about. We knew what the blacks were like. And here's an Irish Catholic, Boston, Mass president. He doesn't know anything about the Deep South. And he didn't. To be sure, he didn't know anything. But he knew something about the Constitution and the laws. That you can't keep black people out of institutions of higher learning. But the governor of Mississippi, the governor of Alabama, the governor of Arkansas, and you know they've never lived down the reputation, those states since then, they're still thought as old dead-end alley hick states, and that's about all they are. Arkansas and Mississippi and Georgia and South Carolina and Alabama, but especially Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. Those three governors came out, no, we will not obey. Now, what? Robert Kennedy was Attorney General then, and he was trying to get the forces together, get Kennedy to agree and get the governors to agree. The governors called out Mississippi Highway Patrol. The Highway Patrol was going to fight the National Guard. The National Guard sent out by the president, and the Highway Patrol, hey, they were going to listen to any white boy up in Washington. What they believed was their old boy governor down in Mississippi. A lot of good old fat Mississippi sheriffs and Mississippi sheriff's deputies down there in Alabama and Arkansas, sheriffs and sheriff deputies. Good old tobacco chewing, catfish fishing men down there. They're not going to go for this white boy stuff of loving the black people. And so you had people killed through all of that. Shots were fired. You go to the Lyceum today, which is the major building on campus at Ole Miss, and there are bullet holes, pocket holes, all the pillars across the front of the building when all the guns and things went off down there. Highway Patrol against the National Guard. It's like the Civil War all over again, 100 years later. What's causing all of this? The rage and the confusion in our nation. What's causing that? We surrendered biblical notions and biblical views. Amen. And it's going to happen again, probably in a more sophisticated form. Or maybe not. Maybe it'll even be worse than what we saw back in the 1960s, when rage and confusion take over again. You see, if you don't have God, think the devil is the one in control. And he's the mastermind of confusion and rage. And he's the one who brought it in the 60s. He's the one who has the power to bring it again. You had others like Medgar Evers, who was the black education leader in Mississippi, who walked out to his car to get in it. Assassinated, a high-powered rifle across the street. He was murdered. Of course, a number of blacks were murdered, but these are leading blacks. Now, James Meredith was never killed, but he went to his classes with National Guard, with United States Marshals, U.S. Marshals, sitting in class with him for several years. He couldn't live down there. There was a threat against his life. He was the only black student at the University of Mississippi. And the University of Alabama wasn't doing any better. And neither was LSU and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or University of Arkansas. They weren't doing any better. You have to be from the South to really be able to appreciate those days, or maybe you can read some and remember back. But Medgar Evers in Mississippi was assassinated, and so forth. All right, then March the 12th. March the 12th. Eugene McCarthy, that enigma in American politics. Eugene McCarthy, on March the 12th, won 42% of the vote in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. Now, of course, there was going to be a challenge on the then president, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. And McCarthy and Robert Kennedy were talking together, when they were going to run. And Robert Kennedy, from his aides, found out the best advice was for him not to try to do anything, not make his move. He's a little too young yet. Don't make your move in 68. wait until 1972, the next election year, presidential election year, and make your move then. Well, whenever Robert Kennedy, who was a senator then, saw that McCarthy had taken such a large share of the votes, 42% of the New Hampshire Democratic primary on March 12th. By the way, Robert Kennedy wasn't even in the race at that time. That I think about 5 or 6 days later, he jumped in the race rather belatedly and went on to post some surprising upset victories over McCarthy. And that will lead to something here I'll say in a moment. Then the same month, March the 31st, some of these are bigger events than others. You'd be asking yourself, where was I when I heard the news? People flipped on their television set for an address from the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, and the whole nation was astounded with the news. I will not accept the nomination of my party as your president. He was resigning. I mean, that was the end. He was not going to run for re-election. He had, of course, taken over after Kennedy's death, John F. Kennedy. And he announced he would not run for re-election. Then 4 days later, 4 days after we hear this, I mean everything was just one thing after another in 1968. 4 days after learning about LBJ in a black neighborhood in Memphis at a theater, Martin Luther King Jr. leaned over a balcony and was assassinated with a high-powered rifle. That was news that shook a nation again. Martin Luther King Jr., the most outspoken for the black people in the South, who had his march on Washington and gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream, that if you hear on tape still just raises goosebumps all over your back. I have a dream. I'll never forget that speech, I have a dream, right at the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. And here he's assassinated. Now there is the savior of a whole generation of young black people who's been killed. You know what that's going to lead to. All the riots and all the bloodshed. And the blood's going to flow in the cities after that. And as we'll see, it certainly did. As a matter of fact, the end of that month, April the 23rd, some radical revolutionary students under the lead of Mark Rudd, who was the local leader for SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, I'm sure you remember those names, took over the university buildings at Columbia University. He wrote a letter to the president of the university swearing at him. They stormed in. They took over the president's office. They took over administrative buildings, the SDS under Mark Rudd, Students for a Democratic Society, which was a radical revolutionary group that later turned into the underground Weathermen group, the radical ones that went around killing judges and exploding vaults and banks and things. And there are pictures of Rudd and others sitting at the president's desk, leaned back, their feet up, smoking his cigars there. Taking over, can you imagine that happening today? You know, taking over a major university, taking it over? People wouldn't even have the nerve to do that today. Oh, I hear they got a few protests up at Dartmouth there, but taking over the school? Mark Rudd and company did at Columbia University. Then on April the 29th, April the 29th, on Broadway, the musical group Hair opens, singing their song, This is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Do you remember that music and that song? This is all, friends, 1 year, 1968 in this country, nihilism, Nietzsche's nihilism. This is the age of the dawning of Aquarius. We have riots around the world in May, the month of May. For instance, in May 10th, 367 people are injured in Paris rioting. And the whole world was like a boiling pot. On June the 1st, a particular song reached #1 on the music charts and stayed there for a long time, and that song was Mrs. Robinson. Do you remember that? Hey, Mrs. Robinson, #1 on the music charts. June the 1st. 5 days later, Robert Kennedy, he was in the race against McCarthy now. He had given a speech in a ballroom in Los Angeles, and he was trying to get back to his room. He walked through the hotel pantry there, the kitchen, and there was an Arab, Sirhan, who shot him in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. You may remember the TV pictures of Senator Kennedy's lying on the floor in that pool of blood, and his eyes were open. He was as dead as a doornail, and his eyes were open in that vacant, far-away look and stare that a dead person had. And many people have built on that imagery. You know, that every dead person looks like that, but they've tried to make something out of it. There's Senator Kennedy, who may well have become President Kennedy that year. Now, he was going to have a tough race, but he had some good blood and some good names behind him, like his brother. He may well have been our president. How would history have been different in the world, in the United States, if Robert Kennedy had become president in 1968, rather than who you know became president? Who launched one of the worst political fiascos, Richard Nixon, in all of American history? Would that never have happened if Robert Kennedy was president? Well, it's just hypothesis. Who knows? But I'm sure our nation, our whole history would have changed as a result of that man being president versus Richard Nixon. But he's assassinated by Sirhan. June the 19th, we had the Poor People's March in Washington. July the 5th, you might not have realized this, although I'm sure some of you will remember this. The desecrating of the United States flag is made a federal crime. Did you realize prior to 1968 you could do what you want to with the flag? Do you realize today that is a federal crime to burn an American flag? That is a federal crime. That is a crime for which the FBI will come in and arrest you. You know, you don't have the right to go out in your backyard and have one of these little toy American flags and burn it. You see the Ayatollah Khomeini and all those guys burning flags over there, and that's one reason they're doing it. It's a federal crime in the United States to burn an American flag. Why do they have to pass that law? They're trying to get the reins on this society, this generation. The young people are going wild, anti-government, anti-everything, burning American flags to show their disgust with American government. And so they have to pass a law that desecrating the United States flag is a federal crime, punishable by fine and imprisonment for burning a piece of cloth, and that the FBI will get on your trail if they find out that you've done that. That was a law passed July the 5th, the middle of the year, 1968. On August the 8th, Richard Nixon is nominated at the Miami Convention. 2 weeks later, August the 20th, the Soviet tanks roll into Czechoslovakia, ending the so-called Prague Spring. Remember that Czechoslovakia, as were the other countries in Eastern Europe, were more or less under the domination of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union had given them some leeway. The leash wasn't that tight. There was a slack in the leash and the rope. And we had a leader in Czechoslovakia who was heading toward democratic ideals. And a lot of things were happening in Czechoslovakia at that time. I mean, this is right back in your day and age. This isn't like Second World War or something. This is back in your day and age. Czechoslovakia was headed toward a democratic society like the United States. Well, the Soviet tanks rolled in immediately and occupied Czechoslovakia, took over the nation, and ended the so-called Prague Spring. That spring in Czechoslovakia when the leaders were headed toward a democratic-type government and policy. And as a result, the leader was sent way off, and I think he was in the Ministry of Forests, you know, as a result. The president of the country, he had to be given some position to appease all the people there. You can't execute him. So they stuck him with some, desk job, the Ministry of Forests. Or how about a week later, August the 26th to the 29th, you've got the other convention had been in Miami. The Republican convention had been in Miami. The Democratic convention is up there where O'Daly is mayor in Chicago. And you have those tremendous riots that took place at the Chicago Democratic Convention. With the swearing, it was right on television. You could read his lips. You could read what word, 4-letter and some more letters added to it, what word Mayor Daley was saying. And as someone has said, that one event right there where he told his troops to shoot with the intent to maim. I mean, shoot people who were protesting. Now, the government couldn't get away with that today, you see. Man, there'd be lawsuits 1,000,001 if the government shot someone like that. But we're in terrible times now. And he gave the order to shoot to maim for life. The mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley. And as someone said, that forever put in the past American history backroom politics. All that was seen on national television. You know, Daley, that was an old boys club there, controlling, not responsible, not accountable to anybody. Not Daley and his crew in Chicago. They ruled that city with an iron hand, and they had for a number of years. And all that was exposed on national television. Or, shortly after that, October the 12th through the 27th, the Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City. Now, some important Olympic records were set then, but that's not what I'm concentrating on. What I'm concentrating on happened to be a track and field event. The Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City, when John Carlos and Tommy Smith, the two American racers, sprinters, whenever they were won a gold medal. Tommy Smith won the gold medal and Carlos won one of the other medals. Two black Americans. You know, the thing to do is you got those three things you stand on whenever they're presenting the medals. For gold, the highest up, and silver on one side of him, a little bit lower on the other side of him, bronze for the lowest one. And you play the national anthem of the one who won the gold medal. Well, the one who won is a black American. And someone who took one of the other medals was a black American. And do you remember on television what they did? They bowed their head and held up their black power sign.
This message will be continued